for joining us at this webinar. Today we're going to talk about feedback, and we're actually going to start off by trying to see what are the things that we associate with feedback. So if I could ask you to write in the chat box, if you could write the first 3 words or expressions that come to your mind when you think about feedback. Okay? In the chat box. Okay, I can see some people typing. Okay. Honest, focused, that's interesting. Evaluation of teaching quality. Okay, let's wait for some more. Tact, assessment, unbiased, developmental, boff, sandwich. Okay. Sandwich is something that we're going to mention today, actually. Okay. Pointer for teacher development. Okay. Well, it's very interesting to see that when we think about feedback as teachers and trainers and managers, we instantly think about post-observation feedback. But feedback is, in fact, a much more general thing. It's something that we do every day, not just in professional relationships, but also in personal, or maybe even first of all in personal relationships. But as managers, we obviously find ourselves giving feedback to our staff almost every day. Now, generally, when we talk about feedback, we really talking about, or we really think about how good something was. Like, for example, if you travel a lot, then at airports, you get more and more often asked about your experience at airport toilets or your experience of going through security. So how good something is. So as I said, as managers, we tend to find ourselves giving feedback to our staff almost every day. And a lot of the time, it's actually informal feedback. But there are obviously occasions when feedback is expected and when feedback is more formalized. And one of those occasions is obviously post-observation feedback. But what we're going to talk about today is true for any kind of feedback that we give, both in our professional and in our private lives. But first of all, what I would like us to have a look at is some of the stereotypes which many people have with regards to giving feedback. So a lot of you might remember this from your childhood. Perhaps this was something that you heard from your grandparents or from your parents. And that's, if you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. Now, we know that it's not very useful when it comes to our job as managers, but it's an extremely strong stereotype, and it is one of the reasons why feedback may be uncomfortable for us as managers. And we will look at other factors that make feedback difficult in a moment. Now, you'll probably recognize this picture, and this is something that Andy, I think, mentioned earlier. You'll probably recognize this picture as a symbol of what a lot of us have been taught as a simple but very effective method of giving feedback, and that's the sandwich approach. And basically, when we're talking about the sandwich approach, we're really talking about in feedback, first giving the good news or talking about the good stuff, then talking about the bad stuff, and then at the end kind of sprinkling it with a little bit of encouragement. Now, a lot of people are beginning to say very openly that this kind of approach is in fact slightly cynical, and I tend to agree with that. And the reason why I agree with that is because it is a very stereotypical and very formulaic way of structuring feedback. And I'm absolutely sure that a lot of the stuff that you work with, and certainly a lot of the stuff that I have worked with, they have worked out that after the good news, they're going to get hit with the bad stuff. And then at the end, there's going to be a little bit of good news as well. So what they tend to do is they tend to ignore the good news at the beginning, ignore the encouragement at the end, and they tend to just focus on the bad stuff. So why is it that feedback is actually difficult? Well, I'd like us to look at why feedback is difficult from the two perspectives. So from the perspective of an observer, but also from the perspective of an observed teacher. And I'm going to ask you in a moment to write again in the chat window why you think feedback might be difficult. But first, I'd like to give you an example. So from the point of view of an observer, feedback might be difficult because we have this fear of giving negative feedback and of hurting the teacher's feelings. And that actually goes back to what we've talked about a couple of seconds ago. You know, if you don't have anything good to say or anything nice to say, don't say anything. Now, from the point of view of the observed teacher, it's the fear of being criticized. Nobody likes being criticized, and people are afraid of that. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to type in the chat window one or maybe two reasons why you think feedback might be difficult. If you could indicate with a letter O if that's the observer's point of view, or T if that's the teacher's point of view. Okay. And then let's see if you've come up with the same ideas that I have. Okay, I can see Adam typing. Okay, any ideas from anybody? Personality of the observed person, absolutely. Being defensive, yes, very much so. And let's see if there's anything else coming up. Can you ask the question again? Yes, I can. Why do you think feedback is difficult for the observer or for the observed teacher? Can you put one or maybe two reasons into the chat box? You want to find a way of giving feedback in such a way as to be truly heard. Absolutely. And this is a crucial thing in feedback. Feedback doesn't make sense if we don't make ourselves heard. But this is one of the things that we're going to talk about later. Wording of feedback so that it's absolutely clear for the observed. Yes, communication in other words. Okay, I can still see people people dislike when we give feedback. Absolutely, yeah. Nobody is extremely fond of feedback. Fear of negative impact on the teacher future performance. Yes, very much so. Okay, so there are a lot of different reasons why feedback might be difficult, both for the observer and for the observed teacher. And I'd just like to show you what are the reasons that I have come up with for why feedback might be difficult. Well, if you look at the point of view of the observer, fear of confrontation. Confrontation is something that we generally find very uncomfortable, and that's why we don't really want to find ourselves in a situation of confrontation. And then also, you know, if we're talking about commercial organizations, for example, private language schools, it's very difficult for the observer or for the manager to give teacher enough time and space to develop, because sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where we have to kind of push for results because we need to change teachers' behavior in order to satisfy the clients, or because the client has been giving negative feedback. If we look at the perspective of the observed teacher, then an extremely important factor is teachers' expectations. And very often what you hear from teachers is, tell me what was wrong. So again, if we go back to that sandwich approach, they're not listening to the good news, they're just listening to the bad stuff, or they want to hear the bad stuff. And then sometimes also teachers are not quite sure what to expect, especially if they are beginner teachers and if that's their first post-observation feedback, for example. And one last reason which I would like to mention is fear for their jobs. I mean, you know, this is an extremely important factor, because when you go to observe a teacher, there's always that thought at the ball. Most of the time, there's that thought at the back of their heads. What if I perform not up to the standard? Am I going to lose my job? So if we want to summarize this, we're really looking at very strong emotions which make feedback difficult. And certainly from my point of view, if we're talking about strong emotions, one of the things that I have always found quite difficult and quite challenging is the fact that I have not been taught counseling skills. And yes, over the course of my training and management career, I have developed ways of dealing with strong emotions, but it's been a very long and difficult journey. And I always say that I wish that I had been taught these counseling skills because, when you manage people, when you give feedback, you're bound to come up against very strong emotions. Now, one of the things that we say about feedback, about observations and feedback, especially when we try to explain to teachers why observations are so important, we very often tell teachers that an observation is like putting up a mirror so that they can see how they behave in the classroom, what it is that they do in the classroom. Now, we know that unfortunately, sometimes we don't actually see our reflection in the mirror, but what we see is something that we want to see. So that's another reason why feedback might be difficult. Now, I'd like us to concentrate on the features of effective feedback, and this is something that I would like you to think about. I'm going to give you a hint. The first hint is we're looking for 3 features of effective feedback, and these 3 pictures actually represent those 3 features. So if you could take 1 or 2 minutes to think of what are the features of effective feedback as represented by those pictures, and then and if you could type those into the chat box, and then I'll show you what I had in mind. Timely, accurate, supportive. Okay. Very good. Any other ideas? Okay, I can see that people are typing. Timely, agreed. Yes, absolutely. Doesn't damage the relationship. Very good. Agreed. Yes. Okay. Developmental. Absolutely. Okay. And it depends on the purpose, very much so. But generally speaking, when we talk about effective feedback, and again, this is not just about post-observation feedback, but this is about any kind of feedback that we give to anyone in any situation. The 3 features of effective feedback would be effective feedback produces an agreement, and this is something that you've mentioned, as to what is good and what action should be taken. Effective feedback is efficient. And finally, effective feedback should improve or at least not worsen the relationship between the sides. And these are the 3 most important features of effective feedback. So if we look at these 3 features, let's try to find what are the key words or key concepts in those 3 features. Well, first of all, we're talking about agreement, about what is good and what action should be taken. I can see that my boxes have moved a little bit, but the key words here would be agreement, good, and action to be taken. So that's the first. And then efficient, and we're talking, of course, about time. Feedback, in order to be good and effective, cannot go on for too long. And then the last key word is relationship. And again, the box has moved a little bit, but the key word is relationship. And the relationship is something that the relationship between the sides is something that we're going to spend quite a lot of time talking about or talking around in this webinar today. Because the relationship between the feedback giver and the feedback receiver is so important, I thought that it would be a good idea to look at what can affect that relationship in, again, any feedback, but obviously this is very relevant to post-observation feedback. So the first thing that I would like us to look at is the so-called drama triangle. Well, I'm going to explain what the drama triangle is in detail in a moment, but basically a drama triangle shows the roles that we take on in any confrontation and generally in quite a lot of interaction with other people. And it's an instrument that shows how we prevent psychological equality in relationships by taking on set roles. Now, the concept of the drama triangle was devised by or suggested by Stephen Karpman quite a long time ago in 1968. And Karpman was a student of a person who invented or founded a certain school of psychotherapy, which was called transactional analysis. His name was Eric Berne, and one of the most famous books that he's written is Games People Play. Now, this book was first published in 1964, so a long time ago, but since then it has sold over 5 million copies. And if you ever get hold of that book, I really recommend reading it. It's absolutely fantastic. So what about this transactional analysis? Well, Berne said that insight into patients can be gained by analyzing the social interactions. And those interactions he called transactions, and that's why this whole school is called transactional analysis. He investigated the communications between individuals, and he noticed that there are certain patterns of transactions which happen repeatedly in everyday life, and those repeated patterns of transactions he called games, and that's why the title of the book is Games People Play. So Stephen Karpman comes from that, who suggested the term drama triangle. He comes from that school of psychotherapy. So let's go back to drama triangle. Well, drama triangle, as I said earlier, basically shows the roles we take on in any confrontation especially, but also in other types of interaction with other people. And again, as I said earlier, it shows how we prevent psychological equality in relationships. And we prevent psychological equality in relationships by taking on certain roles. And these are set roles. So what are these roles? Well, the first role is the role of a persecutor. The persecutor is the person for whom the most characteristic communication would be "it's all your fault." The second role in on the drama triangle is the role of a rescuer. And again, the most characteristic communication for the rescuer would be "poor you, let me help you." And the third role is that of a victim. And again, the most characteristic communication would be "poor me." Now, typically, what happens in any kind of communicative situation is that we tend to move from one role to another. But the role that we start off with is the role that we actually, most of the time, is the role that we learned in our childhood. So it goes back to our roles in the family as we were children. So let's have a look at some of the features of the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim, and then we're going to look at it in the context of teaching, and actually, to be more specific, in the context of post-observation feedback. Okay, so persecutor is the person who is controlling, who knows better, who tends to apportion blame, the critical parent. The rescuer is the person who can be seen as an enabler, pain reliever, somebody who gives permission to fail. Now, all that sounds absolutely fantastic, but we take on those roles in order to be able to manipulate people. And I'm going to explain that in a moment. Let's first have a look at the role of the victim. So the victim is the person who is powerless, helpless, and unable to achieve insights, and that's really important. So I've mentioned manipulation, so how do the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim manipulate the person that they are talking to or that they are communicating with? Well, the persecutor manipulates by domination, by forcing their needs and their views on other people. The rescuer manipulates by promising an easy way out of a difficult situation. And the victim manipulates by openly stating their submissiveness and lack of responsibility for the situation. Okay, so these are the ways in which people manipulate one another when we're talking about the drama triangle. So how does that relate to post-observation feedback? Well, let's have a look at an example situation. So here is the situation from our everyday practice. You have observed a general English monolingual class at B1 level. And what you have noticed during the observation was that the teacher did not set up per work efficiently. And basically, the main problem was that students didn't seem to understand the instructions for per work. So the teacher didn't give very clear instructions. Now, because students didn't understand the instructions for per work, the result of that was that students started using their first language. And the teacher didn't really react to the students' use of the first language. So, if we think about the drama triangle and the three roles that we can take on in feedback in the communication with teachers, what would be the things that the observer could say as a persecutor, as a rescuer, and as a victim? Well, if I wanted to take on the role, or if I was forced to take on the role of a persecutor, then I could say something like, "It's your fault that students don't use English in class." As a rescuer, I could say, "I'll tell you how to set up per work in class and everything will be fine." So I'm promising an easy way out of a difficult situation. And as a victim, I could say, "I've spent so much time explaining things to you and you still don't do what you should be doing." So these are the communications that in that particular situation from the persecutor, from the rescuer, and from the victim. Now, one extremely important thing about the drama triangle is that the persecutor and the rescuer are the so-called one-up roles. And if we take on a one-up role, so if we take on the role of a persecutor or a rescuer, we're actually pushing the other person. And in this case, if we're talking about post-observation feedback, we're pushing the observed teacher into the role of a victim. But conversely, if we take on the role of the victim in the post-observation feedback, we're actually pushing the observed teacher into one of the one-up roles, into the role of a persecutor or the role of a rescuer. So if we assume the role of a victim, for example, and the teacher assumes the role of the rescuer, they will do everything to please you, irrespective of their real needs. And if they take on the role of the persecutor, they will become aggressive and destructive. So how do we get out of the drama triangle? Well, getting out of the drama triangle is basically all about changing communication styles. So again, if we look the most characteristic communications from persecutor, from the rescuer, and from the victim, if we want to change communication styles, we also change our roles. So from the persecutor who says, "It's all your fault," and rescuer who says, "Poor you, let me help you," and from the victim who says, "Poor me," we change to a person who is assertive enough to say or to declare, "I have needs." From the rescuer, we change into a person who shows caring and who says, "I'm listening." And from a victim, we change into a person who is vulnerable and who openly says or admits that they're struggling. Okay, now, another aspect of feedback which I would like to look at is our attitudes to conflict. And this is something that's very strongly connected with the drama triangle, as you'll see in a minute. Well, psychologists say that we all have our inbuilt attitudes to conflict. And these attitudes can be classified if we look at two basic criteria which can be placed on two axes. So we've got the horizontal axis of cooperation and the vertical axis of assertiveness. So assertiveness means how much I want to protect my interests. Cooperation means how much am I interested in protecting the interests of the other party. So the interests of the person that I'm talking to. So if cooperation and assertiveness are very low, then we have the strategy of avoiding. So I'm not really interested in protecting my interests. I'm not really interested in protecting the interests of the other party. And so the best thing that I can do is avoid conflict at all cost. Now that obviously doesn't solve conflict. Now, another attitude is standing your ground. And as you can see, this is an attitude where assertiveness is very high. So I'm very keen on protecting my interests and meeting my needs, but I don't really care about the other person's interests or needs. So cooperation is very low. And then we have the attitude which is called giving in. And as you can guess, this is an attitude where my interests really don't matter. I'm mostly interested in protecting the interests and meeting the needs of the person that I'm talking to. So I'm giving in to that person. Now, the attitude which is sort of in the middle is compromise. And that would seem a very good solution. And although it is a relatively good solution because there is a relatively high level of assertiveness and a relatively high level of cooperation, it's actually not the best attitude. The best attitude is collaborating. So in other words, making sure that my interests are protected, but also that the interests and needs of the other person are protected. And if you think about the business context, this is a kind of a situation which can be, we can also see in negotiations, and a win-win negotiation is an example of collaborating. Now, if you look at these attitudes to conflict, I'd like you to think for a minute which attitudes would be a perfect festering ground for the drama triangle. And if you have any ideas, can you put them into the chat box? Which of these attitudes do you think would be a perfect breeding ground for drama triangle? Any ideas? Anybody? Okay, I can see people avoiding. Absolutely. Any other ideas? Okay. Some people are typing, so let's wait for that. Giving in. Okay. Standing your ground. Absolutely. Okay. All right. You've actually hit the nail on the head. The three attitudes which are a perfect breeding ground for a drama triangle are avoiding, giving in, and standing your ground. Now, I have a very strong belief that lesson observations and well-conducted feedback are a single most effective tool for teacher development. But this means that we have to get it right. And it's not easy to get it right. So what I would like us to do for the next couple of minutes is to have a look at a number of do's and don'ts, a very practical kind of advice that goes with giving post-observation feedback. And for each, I'm going to list a couple of categories. The first is level of detail, as you can see, and for each of those categories or for each of those points, I would like to give you a do and a don't, or maybe two do's and a don't. So when we're talking about the level of detail of post-observation feedback, it's a very good idea to give detailed comments and to concentrate on concrete details. And it's not a very good idea to give comments which are too general to be really helpful. So even if we just want to tell the teacher, you know, that was a great lesson, but we don't give them any other information, it may be nice to hear that the lesson was good, but if we don't give them specific information, that feedback is actually not going to be very useful for the teacher because it's not going to help the teacher develop. Now, when we're talking about the level of detail, that is something which in my mind is very strongly connected with an observation crit sheet or observation record sheet. And I'd like to show you the kind of observation record sheet which I tend to use. This is an observation sheet which clearly records what happens in the lesson. So I've got a column where I actually write what happens in the lesson, and only next to what happens in the lesson, I write down my comments. And I tend to start the comments with a tick. If this is a comment about something that I liked, that I found interesting, that I found worked well, or a question mark next to something that I thought didn't work quite well, or I wasn't quite sure why the teacher did something like this. And then at the end, you've got a summary which basically prioritizes those areas which were good and the areas that need action. So that obviously goes back to the features of effective feedback. And from that, of course, you can actually draw aims for the next observation. Now, the second category or second point is who is actually the feedback giver? Well, it's a good idea for the observer to take responsibility for your comments. So to say things like "I think" or "in my opinion," because that means that the person who gives feedback is actually available for discussion for the observed teacher. But if you say things like "everybody says" or "experienced teachers say this" and "experienced teachers say do that," it actually means that the teacher has no chance to discuss issues which were raised with the author of the comment. The third point is an interesting point because it's about time which should elapse between the lesson and feedback. Now, it's an interesting point because it's possibly the most difficult to define. And it's possible to say that we should allow for some time for the teacher to take in what has happened, because that gives them a chance to evaluate what has happened in the lesson themselves. And there is no don't for this point, because the point under the green tick actually summarizes it all. Now, generally speaking, I'm not very fond of a solution where you give feedback to the observed teacher right after the observed lesson, right after the lesson. But, we know that life is life, and we sometimes forced to do things that we're not very fond of doing for reasons of logistics, etc., etc. So yes, I have given feedback to teachers right after the observed lesson, but if I can avoid it, then I try to give feedback after a couple of days. But obviously, again, you can't wait too long, because then the lesson becomes a very distant memory for the teacher. It also becomes a very distant memory for you as the observer. And again, if you want to give sufficient detail, it's a good idea for you to remember the lesson quite well. Now, the next point is participation. It's a good idea to talk about your feelings, but also as the observer, but also to probe the attitudes and views of the teacher. So in other words, what you want to do is you want to allow the teacher to actively participate in feedback. You don't want to be the person who gives advice on the plate. The more active teachers are in feedback, the more they're going to take out of it. The more teachers are active in feedback, the more constructive that feedback becomes. And actually, during a discussion, things could come up that you never thought about in the first place. The next point is a point about quantifiers. When you give feedback, and again, this is not just about post-observation feedback, but about feedback in general. It's a very good idea to use specific quantifiers. So in this situation, on this particular occasion, in this lesson, if we're talking about post-observation feedback, and it's not really a good idea to use universal quantifiers. So saying things like, you never do this, you always do this. I'm sure you'll remember situations from your personal lives where you've heard things like, "Oh, you never leave the door open, leave the door closed," or "you always leave the door open." Well, that's not exactly effective feedback. And one of the most important problems, okay, it's got number 6, but it is actually one of the most important issues when we talk about the do's and don'ts of feedback, is that it's extremely important to separate the problem from the person. So we need to make it clear that we're not criticizing the person, but we're trying to eliminate a problem that we have noticed. So if you say things like, you just can't do this, can you? Well, that's criticizing the person. It's not about the problem that you have noticed, but it's about the person. And last but certainly not least, it's extremely important for the teachers to know the purpose of observation and the purpose of feedback. And this is something that actually came up in your comments earlier on. It's also very important to give the teacher a feeling of being listened to. And the reason for this is that if they feel that you're listening to them, they're much more likely to listen to you. Okay, so let's do a practical exercise to finish off this section. What you see on the screen now are 3 extracts from post-observation feedbacks. And first of all, can I ask you to read those 3 extracts? And in the chat box, can you write which of these extracts do you think is the best? Okay, so if you could just read and then write the number in the chat box. Okay, we've got a 3. We've got a 3, a 3. Okay, so we've got some agreement there. Okay, let's wait for more people to say what they think. Okay, we've got 3 again. Okay, so people seem to be in agreement. Number 3 is the best one. Okay. 3, but depending on the teachers, for some 2 might be more useful. Okay, well, so let's start off by looking at number 3. I agree that number 3 is possibly the best out of the 3 that you see on the screen. But there is one little problem with number 3, and the problem is hidden in the questions that the observer asks. So if you look at the questions, they go like this. Did you notice this as well? So did you ask the teacher, did you notice what I noticed as well? What do you think was the reason? This is fine. Do you think you could have done anything differently? And here is the problem. Now, in lawyer talk or lawyer speak, this is called a leading question. And this is actually not a question. This is a statement. And the statement is, I think you could have done it differently. And the real question is, how? Okay, so let's go back to number 1. Number 1 is, this was a great lesson. Thank you very much. I'm not going to observe you anymore. You're totally on track. Well, that is so general that it's actually really not useful at all. So that actually breaks rule number 1 of the level of detail. Now, the second one is an interesting one. I can see that you have problems with classroom management. Well, that's criticizing the person, isn't it? It's not you who have problems with classroom management. It's not the teacher who has problems with classroom management. There is a problem with classroom management. There is an issue with classroom management. And then the second sentence, it's important to make sure that students understand your instructions and that per work is organized efficiently. Well, says who? So who is actually the feedback giver? If you think this is important, then why not say, I think it's important that students understand your instructions, and then the teacher can discuss this with you. Okay, now the last thing that I would like to talk about very briefly today is this. How do I know I get it right? Well, many years ago, when I started off as an academic manager, and I was doing observations, and I thought I was doing it right, but I wasn't really quite sure whether what I do is perceived in the same way by the teachers that I was line managing. So I talked to a lady who is a friend and also an ex-student of mine who is a psychotherapist, and we talked about feedback a lot. And she told me something that I found very interesting. She said, feedback, the kind of feedback that you do and the kind of feedback that I do in therapy are actually very similar. And she showed me a scale which she uses in order to get her patients to assess the kind of feedback that they get from her. And this is actually what you see on the screen is actually a scale which is also based on that particular scale. So basically what I have done is I have taken the points that we have discussed a moment ago. So level of detail, the feedback giver, time between observation and feedback, feelings versus advice, and generalization. So big quantifiers and small quantifiers and universal quantifiers. And I asked the teachers to, for each of the points, to say where on the scale from -5 to +5 my feedback was. Now, obviously, this needs a lot more explanation. So you need to show them the whole the whole list of do's and don'ts, so that they understand, what -5 means, which is a don't, and what +5 means, which is a very good do. And I have done this, I have given this questionnaire to a lot of teachers in very different contexts, in very different organizations, also teachers of different languages. And I have to say that it's pretty amazing the things that you actually discover. The very interesting thing about this questionnaire is that because of the nature of that category, the time between observation and feedback, because this is a very open category, you can actually learn a lot about what it is that teachers expect and what it is that teachers need in terms of when they would like to have feedback. Okay, well, this is more or less what I have prepared for you for today. I would like to ask you if you have any questions or comments about what we've been talking about. If you do, can I ask you to write them in the chat box? Somebody has already given me feedback. It's time to go. It was really interesting to be here. Have a nice week. Thank you. Okay, I can see some people typing, so let's wait for the comments or questions. Thank you, Anya. That was very useful. Lots of food for thought. Thank you, Graham. I think the one very important comment that I forgot to make at the beginning is that obviously the things that I was talking about, we only really touched on them, but I think these are very important points, and these are the points that I know myself from my own experience are can help you if you start thinking about, your communication style, your attitudes to conflict, and if you analyze the feedback that you give according to some of the things that we've talked about. And an excellent tool is recording your feedback and listening to it. And obviously you need to have the permission of the teacher that you give feedback to, but it is an excellent tool, just as recording yourself in the lesson is an excellent CPD tool. Okay, thanks a lot. Very interesting ideas. Thank you. Very interesting to revisit the importance of focusing on the problem and not the person. Thanks a lot, Anya. Very useful webinar. Thank you very much. I'm really glad that you found it useful. Okay, we still have somebody typing. Is this webinar being recorded anywhere? I think Andy will be able to answer that question, but as far as I know, yes. Oh, I can see that Andy is, yes. Andy has just answered that question. Where can we find it? I'm sure Andy will give you some information about that as well. I think it's the LAMSIG website, probably. Okay. I think Andy is trying to
I'm trying to make
switch
my
on his
camera
camera.
start. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yep.
My camera isn't start, doesn't want to start. But I will try and see if I can make it start. But yeah,
Okay.
the webinar is being recorded, Adriana, while we see if my camera will start. and the recording will be available from the LAMSIG webpage. I'll once I've put it up there, which will be about half an hour after we finish, I'll put a message out on the LAMSIG Facebook page and the Twitter account so that you know it's there. But basically, if you go to the LAMSIG webinar page, I will quickly write down the address for you.
Okay, I can hear Andy typing. The sound is rather weird now. Well, I hope it was okay during the webinar. Okay, here is the link from Andy.
Yeah, so there's the link, and it's not there yet, obviously, because we haven't even finished recording it yet, but it will be there quite soon.
Okay.
If there are no questions, so far there don't appear to be any questions, then we can wrap this up. And I'd like to thank Ania very much for her time and for her very, very interesting presentation. I enjoyed it very much, and I'm
Thank you very
hoping everyone else
much.
did
Thank
too.
you.
And
Thank you.
I think, as I say, it will be up on the website, and I'll make an announcement on the Facebook page and on the Twitter account when it's there. But it'll be sometime within the next hour. It'll appear there. So
Okay.
you can find it at that page that I've just given you. So once again, thank you very much, Anya,
Thank
and
you.
thank you everyone for coming. And hopefully we'll see you again for our next webinar. But LAMSIG's next webinar will be probably in September or October. But I'll give you more details about that when we have them.
Okay. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good rest of the week. I've thoroughly enjoyed being here with you. Thank you once again, Andy, for inviting me. Thank you.